Alright, I think we're going to get started here. It's about 5:05, so we'll get started. It's going to be a pretty personable group today. So maybe if we can just go around and I guess say our names since there's only 5 of us, if everybody's comfortable doing that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Of course.
Awesome.
My name is Brandon.
Ashley. I'm Corey.
Who am I?
Dan.
That's it.
Yay. I'm Rose.
I'm Brenda.
Oops, sorry.
No, that's okay. I'm just the camera person.
What's your name?
Brenda.
And I'm Alexis, and I'm going to be kind of guiding you today on this walk that we're going to be taking through Shrewsbury Reserve. I just want to first off say that I'm a student right now, an undergraduate student, studying environmental education and interpretation here at UWSP. As many of you probably know that there's a pretty good program there. So we give the talks and hikes around here, and today we're going to be taking a hike around Shrewsbury Reserve. It shouldn't be very long, less than a mile, nothing too steep or anything like that. There might be a couple of wet spots because of the rain we had today, but nothing too bad, so no worries about that. But before we get started on our first stop, if everybody could close their eyes for me. And now I want you to imagine how you use water in your everyday life. So starting in the morning, maybe brushing your teeth, taking a shower, using it in the kitchen, washing your laundry, washing your car, watering your lawn, any of those uses. Try to think of how you use water throughout the day. Now I want you to think of all those uses and all those gallons of water combined. And try to see if you can come up with an estimation of how many gallons of water you use personally in a day. Alright, everybody can open their eyes. Do you have any guesses or estimations of how many gallons per day we use? Anything?
I think we'd be surprised by the amount.
Yeah, do you have a guess?
20 gallons.
20 gallons.
70.
70 gallons? It's somewhere in between there actually, so we're getting pretty close.
50.
You have one?
Mine was taken.
Oh, okay. Well, actually, on average, in Wisconsin, we use about 63 gallons per person per day. So it's kind of a lot to imagine if you think of a milk jug, just a gallon jug. 63 of those per day you use. So you can just imagine how many you use per week, how many you use in a year. Multiply that by how many people there are, not only in Wisconsin, in the nation. And there's just a huge use of water daily and, well, throughout a lifetime. So today we're going to be talking about where that water comes from, an underground source, groundwater, as many of you know. It's a pretty important and valuable resource for all of us. So that's what our talk is going to be about. And before we head off, I just want to say I kind of want to make this more of a discussion, especially that there's 5 of us. So if you guys have questions or comments or suggestions or things you want to contribute during the talk, just feel free to do that. I'm not really a lecture type person. I really like more of the discussion aspect. So on the way to our first stop, if you could just think about the landscape here at Shrewsbury, maybe what makes it unique, and then maybe how that might tie into groundwater eventually. Does anybody have any questions? Alright, we'll head off to our first stop. Alright, so did anybody notice anything on the way over about the landscape that's kind of unique about Shrewsbury at all that might tie into groundwater?
There's grass.
There's grass here, so that might tie into groundwater. Anything else we notice around us? There's a lot of trees as well. Okay, so plants, trees in the area. Anything
Soil,
else?
sand.
Soil is sand, yeah. The soil. What about these rocks behind me? Does anybody notice or seen these rocks here?
Glacier's probably dropped them here.
Out in Shrewsbury before? Have you seen these rocks before? Walking around here? You haven't?
Yeah.
No?
Put them there.
You put them there? While you were working here? So you think these rocks came from glaciers? Is that true?
That's my guess.
Dan, that's your... You don't think they're from glaciers? Corey, do you know different?
I think I do.
You do? What do you think?
I think this was pasture, and I think those are field stones that were picked up and put here for religion.
Okay. That is. Actually, it was used as agricultural land. Do you know where they got these rocks from? from the field. Okay.
But what put them there?
Yeah, exactly. So they weren't the glaciers because the moraine is actually east of town where the glaciers stop. So it can't be the glaciers. It's actually, this is the bedrock here. So the bedrock,
Moving water.
what's that?
Moving water
Yeah.
deposits.
And throughout the season, you know, in Wisconsin weather, we have the definite freezing winter and then kind of the hot summer. So the freeze and thaw cycle here has actually cracked and broken a lot of these pieces of bedrock, and they've moved their way up through the soil, and now they lay here. Maybe the people that use this land as agricultural land put them kind of in a nice line for us. Obviously, this probably doesn't happen, but an interesting thing about Schmeekely is that the bedrock layer is really high to the surface, or pretty close to the surface. How close? I mean, yeah. So this is about 5 to 6 feet. So this is about just as far we have to go down in the ground to hit the bedrock here, which is pretty interesting and pretty unique for this area. So this ties into groundwater a little bit, which we'll be talking about later, and actually a little bit agriculturally ties into that as well. So they have a high bedrock layer here in Schmeekely Reserve. There's also something else pretty interesting going on with the landscape itself, and we're going to talk about that at our next stop. But on the way there, I want you to think about a little about the soil out here and what type of soil we might have here. So think about that on our way to our next stop. Is there a
And as well.
Yes.
Neither the bears got in trouble, nor did I.
Good.
Alright, so did anybody think about what type of soil we might have here? Yeah.
100% clay.
You think, I know you said sand before, so you
Changed my mind.
there's some sand in it. But do you think there's any clay in it?
Little.
A little clay. Does anybody else have a guess as to what our sandy soil? Yeah, where we are actually in Schmeekely Reserve, it's called, I'm not a soil scientist, so I'm going to try to break this down as best as I can. It's called PGB. That's the technical name for the soil that we have right here, and that's a plain field series. It's sandy, or excuse me, loamy sand. Has anybody ever heard of the texture triangle before? Soils? Alright, so this is the texture triangle. It's the Department of Agriculture's triangle, and it breaks soils down based on 3 different parts. So there's clay, there's silt, and then there's sand. And ours happens to land right here, this loamy sand. So if you're looking at the triangle, the sand here can be anywhere from about 70 to 85% sand. So it's pretty sandy soil. And to demonstrate the different things that make up a soil, so the sand, the silt, and the clay, if I can get 3 volunteers, that'll be fun. Alright. We'll give you these to represent sand.
Course.
Alright, now these golf balls are going to represent silt. And finally, the super bouncy balls. I know, right? Pretty cool. That was very cool. Those are going to represent our clay particles. So as you can see, there's a difference in size. So the clay is the smallest particle, then we have silt, which is the golf balls, and then eventually we have the biggest particle of soil there is, which is our sand. So since ours is mostly sand out here, and if we could imagine it raining right now like it was earlier in the day, which one do you think the rain would have the easiest time of getting through?
Coarse sand.
The coarse sand, and why do you think that?
There's large air gaps.
Yeah, if you hold your balls together and a little object, you can see the different spaces that develop in there. And sand being the biggest particle is going to have the biggest spaces, though the water should be able to infiltrate and percolate through the soil pretty easy. So we have pretty sandy soils out here, but does anybody see a problem with this?
Water retention?
Water retention? Yeah. Take these back for me. Thank you. Yeah, one of the problems is water retention, because if you can imagine a really heavy rain like we had, what was that, about a month and a half ago, the soil tends to tends to become saturated. So once that soil becomes saturated, it's going to hit that bedrock and it's going to have nowhere to go after that point. So that's why we have little pools and ponds that end up forming here in Schmeekley Reserve. I'm sure if you were out here a month and a half ago, there was probably even miniature lakes out here because the bedrock is so close to the surface, becomes saturated, and then the groundwater actually appears right on the surface itself. So when we went back to the agricultural land that we were talking about earlier, they actually abandoned this land because it was so difficult and so wet to work with. It just wasn't very good for crops or anything. So luckily they gave it, sold it to us, and now we have the beautiful Schmeekley Reserve, so at least we turned it into something good. So we know a little bit about the bedrock and the soil now, and I've been using the word groundwater, but I haven't really told you anything about it yet. So on the way to our next stop, I just want you to think about maybe what you've heard about groundwater, if you've heard the term before, anything, if you've heard it in the news. So we're going to talk about groundwater and try to give you everything you ever wanted to know about it on our next stop. Does anybody have any questions before we leave? Alright, we'll head off to our next stop then.
That's what it says in the
I never knew that actually.
It's not genetic diffusion yet.
Alright, so what do we know about groundwater? Have we heard the term before?
Water in the ground.
Water in the ground. Pretty basic, yes. Anybody else ever heard it? Not an NR 150 or whatever those classes are?
I've heard of
Okay. Alright, so groundwater, the basic definition of it is it's an underground source of water and it's constantly moving through the open pores and spaces within the ground itself, and it actually follows pretty much the contour of the land itself. So groundwater, like you said, is water that's in the ground. But does anybody know maybe what percentage of all water on Earth groundwater actually makes up? Any guess? No guesses?
I want to say it's like 30% fresh water.
You think it's 30% of fresh water? Okay. Anybody else have a
60
60% total or of fresh water?
total.
Anybody else?
Less than that.
Less than that? Yeah, it's actually quite a bit less than that. Now, does anybody know where the most of our water exists on Earth?
Great Lakes region.
I mean in like a type of water, or like body of water. Yep, oceans. So oceans actually represent about 97% of all water on Earth. That's a pretty huge portion. And then next is ice caps. They represent about 2%. Then finally fresh water, which we were talking about a little bit, is just a 1% little sliver there. Now fresh water is made up of two things, groundwater and then surface waters like lakes, rivers, streams, things like that. Anybody have a guess as to the percentage of fresh water those two things make up? 15. Groundwater makes up 15%.
Sure.
Okay. Anybody else? Actually makes up about 98% of it. So even though we see a lot of lakes and streams and rivers and things like that, we don't think about what's actually underground, and that represents 98% of our freshwater sources. So as everybody knows, living things need 4 things to survive and sustain
Food,
life.
water, shelter, space.
And
You said 4.
Yeah.
Food, water, shelter, space.
wait, I'm thinking, okay, so 5 in your definition. Air. Sorry. But water is one of those basic needs that everything needs. So that's why it's so important. That's why we're actually having this talk and walk today. We're going to be talking about fresh water. But it's part of a fancy cycle called the hydrologic cycle, but it's really just the water cycle in layman's terms. So we have the water cycle here. You actually can pass this one around and look at it a little closer.